Very warm welcome to all of you on behalf of the Sattva Knowledge Institute, which falls under the umbrella of Sattva Consulting. We're super happy to have you today on this webinar. And we have, I see there is like different diversified group and the participants there. I think some of them are practitioners who are working in the agriculture and food systems, including the non-profit organization and corporates. We also have people participating from different multilateral organizations like UNDP. We also have people from the funding and philanthropic ecosystems. And also I see, I think, a lot of students who have joined us from different B schools who are ready to work for the social sector. So super happy to have you all with us here today. And just to give you a context that we at Sattva Knowledge Institute, which is the knowledge arm of Sattva Consulting, we focus on bridging the gap between intent and actions to solve the complex sectoral issues through knowledge and collaborative actions. We have 6 practice areas: agriculture, health, digital practice, livelihood, capital for impact, and education. What we do is to solve these complex problems, we have different types of market engagement approaches. Touchpoint or webinar is one of the platform where we interact with the sectoral experts like Devyani here to present today. We discuss with a lot of key questions which is relevant for the topics which will be going deeper into this and talking about I think some of the pathways of solutions, also how philanthropy can play a critical role in terms of solving these critical issues. With this today's touchpoint session, I think which is from the agricultural practice area. I am Debaranjan Pujahari, who lead the practice area at Sattva Consulting, will be the host for today's event. And just to introduce, I think our guest, who is Devyani Hari, she is a sustainability professional who currently works as the director of the Center for Responsible Business based out of Delhi. She is a postgraduate in finance from the Indian Institute of Management, Bangalore, and has more than 18 years of experience across diverse fields, specifically sustainability, circular economy, sustainable sourcing, among others. Currently, she works on the issues of sustainability, SDGs, interface between the private sector and SDGs, circular apparel and management of food loss in the value chains in India. And she also engages through multi-stakeholder engagement on these thematic areas. Recently, she also has been co-authored in one of the policy brief, which is submitted to G20 panel on food losses there. So a very relevant and pertinent expert present here to talk about the food losses and how the circular principles can be applied to reduce the food losses there. So what we'll do is, I think there will be 3 sections of these discussions today. I think we'll talk about 3 different agenda. We'll talk about why this topic is more important, what are the circular principles which can be applied to food losses, and also what is the next action item forward, how different actors can actually play critical role in terms of solving these issues. Now, if you see, I think largely in these sessions, we'll talk about the food losses, which is a very important topic in the food and agriculture in the sector. In the statistics, if I want to recall, I think almost 900,000 millions of tons of agricultural waste is generated from Indian farms. While India is a self-sufficient country in cereals productions, but we also I think reducing, I think a lot of wastage is happening from this agricultural value chain. And largely this comes from the post-harvest losses, and also I think the different losses happening in the value chain from farm to plate. So we also want to make it clear to the audience and participants here that we'll be talking very specific to the food loss and not the food waste. Obviously, there is a difference, and food loss, in a very simple way, I think we talk about when a farmer grows the seed and its consumer, I think, picks the food. Whatever the losses happening in this value chain, we'll talk about the food losses. There is also food waste, which largely I think whatever the leftover comes from our place or whatever I think we throw out from our fridges, those wastage is not part of this today's discussion. We'll definitely cover another topic on food waste, but today's discussion is completely around the food losses into the agricultural value chains, right? So this is what I think, and so I think this is keeping this in mind about the food loss. I think I will request all of you, when you hear the discussions, I think put please, I think, raise your questions into the chat box. I think we'll try to capture your questions related to the food losses. And then the last part of the Q&A section, we'll take those questions with Devyani. We also have received a couple of questions through the registration box, so we'll try to also address some of the questions there. In case questions which will not be able to address because of the time constraint, we'll definitely, I think, get back to you. Please drop your, I think, contact details or email ID. We'll actually reply to you on the answers there. So we'll try to address all the questions which will be raised during this session. So big thank you to be part of these important conversations today. We have experts on Devyani who understand this space very well. And we'll talk about these food losses. So Devyani, welcome you to our touch point on the food losses and application of circular economy. Let's get started from here.
Thank you, Dev, for the kind introduction. And I think two very good pieces of information you started off with, right? One, the different kinds of audience that we have today, especially students. It's always encouraging to speak to them. And two, I think what you talked about bridging the gap between intent and action, because I think we do have the business case for doing something, but what we are missing is the actual action and saying, how are we moving forward on that? So thank you for that. I'm looking forward to the questions and look for your guidance on how we take this forward.
Great. So I'll be asking like some anchoring questions. I think largely this is something which are coming from the sectoral research and also a lot of participants are struggling with. So we'll go deeper one after the other, but this will be looks like I think we'll be doing more interactive in that way. And the first question is very obvious. I think just to give the starting the context, how the food losses is connected to the food security issues. Like as you started, I think in the introduction, we started. I think India started with the issues of like food security in 1960. We started like moving our journey like there on. We have reached to a self-sufficiency in certain crop productions. However, food losses also is critical for like developing country like India, who are still struggling with malnutrition, as well as I think some of the self-sufficiency issues still has to be achieved in pulses and other directions. So how these food losses are connected to the overall food security, and how also it ties to the global sustainability goal. And more importantly for the developing countries like India. And finally, why the food loss is an important topic to India at this current moment? How does it, I think, important for to see agricultural dynamics is impacted because of this food losses? So just throwing, I think, the first level context setting, why this topic is important and how it is connected to the food security issues and pertinent for like a developing country like India.
Sure. So let me take a stab at it. And Dave has kindly said I'm an expert. I'm more passionate. Yeah. So I'll try my best. First of all, I think, Dave, I'd quickly like to reiterate the point that you talked about the food losses and food waste, right? Because food losses is up till the point of retail, and food waste is retail and consumption onwards. And why it is important is on two accounts, right? One, the interventions that you need, the causes of these losses, the food loss and food waste are different. The interventions that you require to address these are different. And typically, historically, what research was telling us that food waste was a bigger problem for developed countries, because they had their infrastructure in place, they had their sustainable agriculture practices, but it was the consumption which was a problem. And accordingly, if you will see that a lot of solutions and a lot of call to action from the developed countries is around food waste. We are in a very peculiar situation that both are equally important to us, right? So India, as a big consumer economy as well, we have both the issue of food loss as well as food waste, right? And I think that's something that we need to keep in mind when we look at that. Now, why is it that food loss is important? Understand this, like let me take your questions in the other way and say, let us look at it in India's context. We clearly know, I think we are studying in economics that agriculture is one of our biggest employers. We are looking at farmers income. Agriculture is the biggest consumer of water. It is the biggest user of land that we have. We are food sufficient, but that does not mean that we have food security, right? We may have adequate food grains, but the challenge that comes, right, is that how do we ensure that there is equal or there is equitable distribution and access to that food is where we are lacking. And food loss is one of the biggest reasons that while we may be producing enough, But because of lack of storage or because of lack of infrastructure or poor harvest policies, not no transport being available, the access varies. Of course, income levels also make an impact, So when I look at food loss, one of the things is that my adequacy in food production is not getting translated into access to food. Now, if I look at some of the figures, right, we still on the global hunger index are in a serious situation. We have been progressively doing well. If we look at our progress on the global hunger index, we are improving year by year, but we are still in the serious zone. We are still saying that about 16% of the population goes hungry, right? When we are talking about nutrition, we are saying that 40% of the food goes waste, but we still, struggle with nutrition. So if we look at better storage, if we look at better availability, if we look at models that divert food to where it is needed, to where it is in excess, to where it is food, there is a clear linkage between managing your food loss and food security, right? That is one. Now you look at the current context in which we are operating globally and so much for, specifically for India as well. We have a case of resources getting depleted. We have a case of climate. I mean, we don't have to go far. We don't have to look at scientific reports. Look at what is happening to us in urban cities, right? We had unseasonal rain in the northern part of the country, and that had direct impact on crops, right? So we have climate we are racing towards emissions. We are saying we have to control our temperatures. We are not taking adequate steps. We have breached a lot of planetary boundaries. And there is a need to control emissions, and agriculture is contributing to 16% of emissions for the country. Now, this is only looking at the production. It is not even looking at the emissions that come from the food loss. There is another statistic that tells you that if we look at emissions from food loss and waste, and we looked at it as a country, then it's the third largest emitter after, a US or a China. Now, that's a mind boggling number. It's as big as a country because we are not managing. So, if I'm working in a context where I'm saying that my climate is changing, I need to reduce emissions, I am going to become water scarce, right? For it is not different, and agriculture is the biggest consumer of water, right? My farmer incomes need to be improved despite uh, per capita income increasing. I don't see that value coming down the supply chain to the farmer. I still have a case where they don't realize the value, where they don't have access to adequate food, where nutrition remains a challenge. Now when I'm looking in all these contexts, right, then for a country like India, this becomes a very important conversation, right? Because climate has a direct impact. Now it's very ironic if I look at reports, we lost wheat because of rains, and a few months earlier the wheat production got impacted because of heat wave. So we have heat on one end, we have rains on the other end. So in that scenario, if I look at it, then managing your food loss becomes an extremely important discussion. Now, why the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals? We have adopted the SDGs the UN proposed, and a lot of countries, almost the entire world, has subscribed to that. And it gives us a framework saying that no one is left behind. The very basic principle of the SDGs is leave no one behind. And there are various facets when I look at managing food loss, right? First of all, I look at SDG 2, which is nutrition, sustainable agriculture, and food security. I can even look at poverty to some extent if I have stability in income, if I have better income for livelihoods, and also look at it like there have been supply chain disruptions where farmers are impacted, and that pushes them back into poverty. We of course have impact on water, we have impact on climate. Sustainable consumption and production, which is SDG 12, is very clearly calling out for this and saying that we halve our food waste by almost 50% by 2030, and we also reduce supply chain losses and other value chain losses as well. So it is asking for very clear action, and there's a target which says we halve it by 2030. And another statistic tells us that today, if we make the effort to reduce our food loss and waste by 50%, then the food that is available today versus what I need in 2050, I will close that gap by more than 20%. I will close that gap more than 20%. I think there was a question in the registrations. I recall somebody said that how do we estimate food loss with changing climate, etc. That's the challenge we have. You know, when we are looking at food systems, we have to start building this as a clear risk factor, as a clear variable now, that first of all, at the current growth rate, at the current requirements, you know, the pressure that we have on land, the pressure that we have on water, the pressure that we have on biodiversity when it comes to feeding the population is already immense. To that, you have to add, and this is where perhaps academia, civil society, research will play a role and say, how do we build this variable in? And any decision that you are taking today on your food systems has to, you know, look into the future and say that these are new uncertainties that we are working with, and status quo is not going to work. So those are some of the things. So if I look at food loss, it ties into SDGs at various levels, you know, at various levels. So that is what makes the discussion important to us. So I hope I've answered your question, that in terms of food loss and food security, there is a clear link, because there is a problem with access for everyone. And that is happening because we are not able to store it. And the other thing is, when I lose food, it is not just the quantity. My security is also coming from the quality. You know, as I don't store properly, I'm not just losing in physical terms, I'm losing nutritional value of a food product, right? And it's important to measure that nutrition loss also and see how we can address that and we can control that. So that is one. SDGs, I told you, it touches various SDGs, whether it be poverty, whether it be hunger, whether it be, you know, climate action, whether it be water, sustainable water resources, whether I talk about sustainable production and consumption, and SDG 17, the collaboration, right? Because without that, in any sustainability issue, we will not get anywhere without collaboration. And such is the case also with food loss. And for India, we are looking at a case, you know, that we have depleting resources, we have water scarcity looming, we do have climate change that is playing a big part. And if we are able to manage our food losses, we are addressing a lot of these challenges. Because please understand that when we lose food, all the resources that have gone into that production are lost to us. You know, they are lost to us, and that is an important consideration, and slow to replenish resources as well.
Absolutely. I think thank you so much, Devyani, and for setting this initial background, because understanding this concept is very important, and this is critical from the point of view of sustainability. Sustainability not only overall for the agricultural production, but also from the like SDG. And you talk about very pertinent questions of not about the production losses. Then there is also like significant amount of nutrient loss also happen in this value chain. So I think thank you for that. And now we should go into like the little bit go deeper into this concept of circularity. Now, obviously, I think this as the term says, circularity, I think this is where I think nothing goes to waste. Every component of the value chain is serves a purpose. And I think we'll try to see how this circularity concept encourages us to think how we produce and how we utilize our resources in terms of the agricultural production. It also aligns perfectly with the urgent goal of reducing the waste and building a more sustainable food system. So as we move towards our conversation to the next level, I think let's take a deep dive how this circularity has the potential to transform these food losses into opportunities. So I'll ask like, I think there are like series of questions. I think there are three interlinked questions. The first question obviously is how can you weave these circular economy principles into strategies that can cut down or reduce the food loss? The second is what type of economic and environmental advantages we can anticipate when this circular principle is applied in the food loss. And finally, it will also be helpful for the audience to bring some of the successful examples of circular models which has already been applied into the agricultural food waste value chain to reduce this loss. So these are, I think, some series of questions which you can delve, I think, deeper in these sections there. And how can we apply the circular principle? If we apply the circular principle, how much of economic and environmental outcome will be anticipated from there? And how can you actually bring some examples which has already been done well in this space, which has really given substantial example of reducing the food losses, especially in the agriculture and food sector, where a lot of the participants are representing from the similar sector. So it will be helpful to bring that lens, Devyani.
Okay. So first of all, I think before we go into weaving circular, I would just like to take a few moments on what circularity is, right? I apologize if the audience is well aware of that, right? And circularity simply is telling us that we change the way we produce and consume. We are on what is called a linear economy. We produce, we consume, and we throw. But what we are saying is that we need to keep the resources in circulation, right? Which means that nothing actually is waste and there is value that can be recovered from everything. Now, there is an argument that says traditionally we were circular, India as an economy, as a cultural society, cultural practices has always been circular. Fair enough. Yes. We have believed in keeping, especially things like clothes or not wasting food, just producing as much as we need or utilizing all parts of a vegetable. If you speak to our grandmothers, traditionally they had recipes for everything. The leaves of the vegetable, the root of the vegetable, the flower of the vegetable, etc. It happened, right? Fair enough. Yes. But circularity, if we expand, one thing is, I think the other fact is that we did move away from those practices. So I think one way is to say that we are rediscovering circularity. But the meaning of circularity is not just saying that I manage my waste well. It means that right from the beginning, when I start and take a decision, how do I build into my design an end of life? How do I start making sustainable choices right from the inception? So it is not just about figuring out what to do with the waste, but it is about how do I produce? What are those sustainable choices that we make? Right? It's the materials, it's the inputs that you use. What is the environmental impact of the choices? The quantities that we produce, can we use cleaner fuels, right? So circularity is about, I think it's showing on the slide here as well, that in your processes, in your production, you minimize waste in the first place. And then you manage waste that you produce, but you first try to see how can I minimize waste. How do I weed out pollution from my production processes? How do I regenerate natural systems? Fairness and inclusivity, yes, I think that's a very important aspect, especially for an economy like ours, because we are looking at a just transition. We are looking at inclusive growth. We are not just looking at environment, but we are saying how environment interventions work for all, especially for the most vulnerable, right? Who are more exposed and less equipped to actually handle that. So when I look at this, there are certain practices that we need to have is that sustainable agriculture, regenerative agriculture, organic agriculture, right? Those are all very clear examples because what they are saying is that I will look at my water footprint. I will look at my fertilizer and pesticide footprint. I will try to minimize the fertilizers that I use today have an impact on the health. They have an impact on the health of the soil. They have an impact on the health of people, right? We don't know what we are consuming. There is a definite shift towards more organic consumption. But to be honest, I don't clearly know what I'm consuming is really organic or not. I am dependent on somebody suggesting that it is organic, and I accept that and I take that, right? So, first of all, if I look at principle one as showing on the screen, and if we are food and agriculture companies, then the thing is that how do I look at production processes that are more sustainable in nature, that regenerate the soil? We are hearing a lot of conversation around regenerative agriculture now. So it is saying that I will look at biodiversity because that is very important around a farm's ecosystem. I will look at the soil health. I will look at soil carbon. I will look at water consumption. And these are parameters that we will very actively track and have plans to work on those, right? It is also in terms of the kind of pesticides, insecticides, herbicides that you use, because that also has an implication. Now, of course, there's a balance between the farmer's income, you having to grow, versus what is acceptable, right? And if we also see, if we are part of global value chains, if we have to export, we have to be very mindful and cognizant of what is it that the global consumer is asking. If certain pesticides, if certain insecticides are banned outside, and we continue to use them in quantities that are beyond acceptable, that is food loss that you are creating in the first place, because that will get rejected, right? So it is there. Now when I want to integrate these practices at a sustainable agriculture level, then that means there is a lot of um farmer capacity building. There is a lot of awareness, but it is also understanding what local wisdom is. It's not that everything has to be taken from outside. The traditional farmer wisdom actually used to work for what the soil health is, what would grow better. It's the kind of decisions you make in the kind of crops you grow, the multi-cropping that you do. So though there are experts, there's a fair bit of research that is happening on this, there's a fair bit of knowledge that is available on this. It is really bridging the gap between knowledge and the person who has to implement it and making it work, right? So that is one aspect of it. It is also the an interesting aspect also is to making the effort between bridging the gap between demand and supply. There was a very interesting case that fellow organization WRI found in their research, is that farmers in a particular location were growing tomatoes, and later they realized that these were not the tomatoes that would be required for processing, right? So there, if there are clear, so you have to know your value chain, you have to know the supply chain through which that product will move, and what the demand is, and what the use is, and what the varieties are. There is a very clear demarcation and what will go to the retail market, what can go to processing, what will go for export. And it's important to build that sort of knowledge and that sort of grading as well at the farm level to do some of your food losses. So that is one. When I talk about managing waste, there are a number of models that are looking to use agri residue now, right? So parts of the plant, you don't really burn anything which causes emissions. You don't really throw away anything, though you can mulch it, but there is upcycling, there is conversion. We see that in terms of textiles, we see that in terms of, biomass, it's being used somewhere. So those value chains are important to explore. But what that would also need is clear logistics and clear value chain support being developed in place as well, because the biggest challenge we face is the source of a certain input and the user are not necessarily. So how do you, either you bring them closer to each other, or you develop sustainable logistics to move it from point A to point B without really adding to the carbon footprint and uh, this one. So that those are things. Then how do we produce? I think value addition food processing is something that is being encouraged, and that also helps increase farmers income if there's simple processing that can be done at their end. And this has an impact on livelihoods also, because what we see is that youth are not very keen to get into just pure agriculture. But if you set up processing units close to farms, it allows you to reduce losses, it allows you to increase income, right? And it allows you to better value add to the product and increase its longevity going forward also, thus reducing your losses even more. So those are some of the practices that you can look at. uh, what are the economic and environmental benefits, right? Now environmental benefits, that's something that if I'm producing in a sustainable manner, I have looked at my emissions right from the beginning, right? I have made a conscious effort to reduce my emissions. Now, if I'm saying there are 16%, and there is also breakup available, which tells me that what the various agricultural activities, kinds of activities that contribute to this, whether it's cultivation, whether it's, the crop residue, whether it's the digestive systems of the cattle, etc. So there's a clear um, data available which tells you what the emissions are. So if you are tracking these systems, and from an environmental point of view, you've started tracking your emissions right from the beginning. Water, you have started, because agriculture is often the culprit. It is termed as a culprit when it comes that our groundwater is depleting. Urban areas have their own challenges of industrial wastewater, domestic sewage wastewater polluting and getting into the potable water streams. But if at agriculture level you start looking at regenerating water, or reducing the usage where it's not needed so much, then that's another benefit that you are looking at. If you are using more sustainable resources, then again, your soil health and soil carbon is something that gets impacted. So those are your environmental benefits right at the farm level. I've not even gone down the value chain till now, right? So this is at the farm level. And economic One is that there is a demand now for more sustainable, regenerative, organic produce. If we are able to show that traceability, if we are able to show those practices, the markets are beginning to reward that, right? And it is also more beneficial for the farmer because your cost of input, your cost of production, there is efficiency of scale that comes in, that starts coming in. Those are the benefits that you have looked at. And you are not wasting what you've produced, you're
Right.
recovering value from that. That's the biggest thing, right? If I produce something and I can't sell it and I can't recover any value, then that's a straight economic loss for me. So first of all, I am increasing the quantity for which I will recover value. I am opening up new opportunities, right? I am looking at more value addition to the process. So that's how I would look at that. And the other thing is that if I'm able to manage my crop residue, I could have startups that are working. Startups means more jobs, more business opportunities, more sustainable products, and a very important thing that you are controlling the pollution that may be associated with crop residue, right?
True.
So there is both an economic and an environment benefit there. When we look at successful examples, now there is a lot of innovation and a lot of technologies that are coming into place. We see innovations, innovative models, not just technical innovations at the food waste level, but at the food loss. For example, we came across a company, we documented it as a case study, and what they have done is they use nanotechnology to increase the shelf life for food, fruits and vegetables while they are being stored and transported, right? So that has a direct impact on the quantum of loss and even the nutritional value. So it has both on that, right? And they are trying to work with farmers, they are trying to work with the ICAR and say that how can we actually now take it to a larger scale, because the technology works, it is affordable, but how do we bring it to more farmers? So there was a very interesting point again, is that technologies do exist, but the technology is just as good or successful as the user who is deploying it, right? Which means that there has to be again a lot of awareness, lot of capacity building for farmers to understand the value of using a technology, to actually deploy that technology, but somebody needs to support them in financing it as well. So all those things have to fall into place. So that is something that we saw. We see that a lot of the food companies, because of fear of expired food, etc., tend to pull their food out much earlier. So there are models that are now converting food into nutritious animal feed, not just any animal feed. And there's a fair bit of research and development that goes into uh, this one, that goes into what that nutrition should be, right? That how do you actually extract the right kind of nutrition for the right kind of animal or livestock, from what is available. So there is a need to support such startups, such innovators with R&D support. They're doing it of their own accord. But if you really want to take up, then they spend a lot of their resources in doing this R&D and also providing traceability. So one thing is that in any sustainable solution that we are looking today, traceability will become very important, because there is always that fear of contamination, there's that fear of reputation, where is my product going to end up and how it's going to be used. I need to understand that. So those, such models we have seen. I do see where somebody's asked a question on nanotechnology for shelf life of meat and dairy products. I will have to find out and get back to you. So one request, Dave and team, would be if we can put such questions together, right? Because what we heard very interestingly for the poultry, for the meat segment, right, is that this is a highly perishable product, and this is a sector which actually has done a lot on its own to reduce its food losses, right? Because the value
Yes.
that they were losing from their loss was so high that they have invested in cold storage and technologies, etc., to bring their losses down to an acceptable level, to minimize it as much as possible. At the top of my head, I'm afraid, Dada Sahib, I don't know, but I will definitely try and find out and get back to you on that one. So I think I've covered a few successful examples. I've covered circularity. The only thing about circularity is please just don't look at it from managing the waste, but look at it that can I actually reduce my waste in the first place? And an important thing here to do would be, and which we are advocating everywhere, is a simple target measure act approach. Our biggest challenge is that we do not measure what our food losses are. We don't really know the hotspots, right? If you are a large company, it would be great if you've actually looked at your value chain and said, okay, this is the biggest area where I'm losing, and these are some of the interventions that I could do, and this is my plan, this is my target that I hope to achieve over the next few years. So I think that is something that needs to be looked at. How do we see the food losses and circularity mechanism in tribal areas of India? I've not really explored this area, but my sense would tribal areas that from a habit point of view, I think typically people tend to be quite sustainable. If there are losses, it's because they can't afford solutions to actually either store or manage or have the knowledge, to manage that product. But let me look at that, because I have not studied a tribal area to answer that, in all honesty.
Great. I think we'll definitely, these are all good questions coming up, and I think we'll try to capture everything, and something which can't address like today, obviously we'll get back to you, but keep shooting your questions, because these are all very good questions in terms of interactions, and we all need to think around this topic. We all need to engage in the discussions, I think, and obviously our responsibility is to get back to you whenever I think we've got the answers. I think we'll definitely follow up with you. Please share your email ID along with your questions, so that we can connect with Devyani after this, I think, call, and then I think get back to you whenever, whatever the materials and information we have, we'll share those information. But very relevant topic, Devyani, you covered largely, I think, the concept, why it is more important, I think, in the context of a developing country like India. Then we'll talk about the circular principles. And I also see very evolving scenario in agriculture, like say, you talked about the bridging the gap between the production cluster and the consumption cluster, right? This is what we want. Traditionally, I think it was not planned. I think the production center were, I think, being traditionally placed in one place. The market yards, which the mandi we say, were placed largely into their one centers, and not every time matching the production center to the consumption center, because the MSP regulated crops only was the priority where mandi was giving into. Now that the FPO sector is very strongly coming up, and FPO and the concept of, I think, the one cluster, one crop per district per crop, all this concept which clearly talk about giving a significant prominence to the production cluster through the FPO route. Hence, getting the due diligence whenever the product FPO is getting created. The role of non-profits or the technical support agency also is important in terms of guiding what is the consumption cluster. Hence, the gap between this production cluster and the consumption cluster can be minimized. The wastage, especially on perishables, which we talked about, whether it's fruits and vegetables, whether it's, I think, dairy, poultry, or poultry, whatever the, I think, livestock sector also perishable. These perishable losses in this perishable sector also can be minimized. So I think the due diligence is much more important whenever we're creating. Most of the time we create the FPO and then think about the market linkage. It actually happens to be the design phase. It should talk about how can you bridge the gap between the production and the consumption market. Hence, plan for the appropriate production clusters.
Absolutely. And I think that's an important role, but you need to create that capacity and that thinking. But interestingly, there is a model. I mean, there are quite a few models, and we saw that at times of COVID when supply chains, traditional supply chains got disrupted. There are a lot of tech companies, where they linked the farmer directly to the consumer. They sort of came up, and we have an interesting example again with an organization called OTIPY, and they
Right.
operate, in the northern zone. And what they do is they have an app which collects from the consumers a day before. So the thing is, they never promise to say that you can have same day delivery. It is very clear that it is a day before, and they aggregate that demand and communicate to the farmer. And because there is no buying in bulk, there is no storing in advance, there is actually less wastage in their particular model, because what they've done is they've taken it directly from the consumer, the doorstep, and they've communicated to the farmer that this is the demand that is coming. And to the consumer, it actually also talks about very interestingly about where the product is harvested. So, if you are a more aware customer, you can know about the carbon footprint. It also asks you whether you want sustainable packaging or you want no packaging, so things like that. And it also tells you what is organic, what is not organic, when it's going to be harvested. So those are very interesting models that are beginning to come into place and start growing the gap. Now one of the things of challenge, and maybe this is more in the food waste also, is that a lot of our food actually moves through the informal sector. We had an interesting conversation with retailers, like the supermarkets and this one, and there was a very interesting statistic that of all the food, right, the fresh produce we are talking about, not packaged food, perhaps 8 to 10% is with them. 90% of it is going through the unorganized sector, and you can see it in the tempos, you can see it in the way it's transported, you can even see sometimes produce and somebody sitting on top of it, so that's how it's being transported. So the kind of solutions that we need to look at, so one, yes, is this demand and supply, but you also need to look at small practices, little things, that how can I start storing better, how can I start transporting better to minimize that loss. And the other thing, you also interesting point that you talked about, for example, a mandi, etc., and maybe it's part of your next question, but I think when we look at some of the government initiatives, right, the government could actually play a huge role. Because if we say that we will have mandis, or we will have agro processing clusters which are zero waste clusters, or this mandi will track its waste and reduce it, or figure out, a circular model where the waste is either reduced, or it is properly handed over to for composting, or it is handed over, for animal feed, or it can actually go into processing. There are various ways to look at it. So I think one way to do it is actually demonstrate, because mandis are not a small scale, there is a substantial volume that you can look at. And if you do it across one or several, then you can actually replicate this across various monthlies.
Absolutely, I think great points there. And I think right now, I think till now we have talked about the, I think both this concept, and the last point is critical to close the session is, I think, what is the action item, I think, on this one. I think we definitely have talked about both this principle of food losses and the promise of circularity. But as we move forward, I think we'll consider a lot of driving forces are also important to make it more action oriented. I think there should be increased awareness of resources and climate challenges. There is also an important role technology can play a critical role in terms of bringing innovation. We talked about that in your, I think, previous point. There are also like different circular business models, which again, I think a lot of enterprises can take up. A lot of, I think, European organizations are definitely following that, how it can be replicated by the Indian companies. And also, as we recently talked about the government incentives, I think a lot of schemes, policies, how it can actually uh, the help in terms of acceleration of the innovations from the startup ecosystem, or even I think organizations which are very focused in terms of applying circularity in their agricultural value chain are the most important driving forces. So the last question probably I'll be asking you on the action item is, what are the enabling factors, whether it's technology, whether it's innovative finance, whether it's policy design and implementation, which play an enabling factor in terms of reducing the food losses. Also, who are the critical stakeholders? I think is it government? Is it like private? Is it philanthropic organization? And how can we orchestrate this collaboration between these stakeholders, which require to reduce this food loss significantly? So what are the enabling factors? Who are the key stakeholders, and how these stakeholders can orchestrate or collaborate between each other to tackle these issues?
So I think they an easy and obvious answer, they're all enabling factors.
Yeah.
Right. And so the thing is that unless I have a policy, now it's very interesting, we have several smaller policies or individual policies that in a way would look at food loss, right? Because if I look at Ministry of Food Processing, they have something on cold storage, they have a mega food park policy, they want to increase the quantum of food, processed food, so as to reduce the losses. But do I have one comprehensive policy, or do I have an overarching plan which looks at food losses and waste in the country? No. So from a policy point of view, I think, how do we get it into an umbrella that works for the different stakeholders. And food is a complicated animal, right? Now your different kinds of food, whether it be grains, whether it be fruits and vegetables, whether it be dairy, whether it be poultry, have different kind of perishability, different kinds of food losses. So you can't have like a standard policy, but you can definitely have an overarching policy, right? And within that you can have various elements, so we don't have anything pulling together, right? Now you look at it, the minute we have made a commitment to net zero, right? And we said that, okay, we are going to be net zero by 2070. The nature of the conversation changed. We are not looking at emissions, how do we grow? Now we are looking at, okay, how do we grow sustainably? How is it that I reduce my emissions, right? What are those steps that I can take? Now, if I have as a country, right, we do have it at an SDG level, our own national indicator framework is a little light on it. Let's put it that way. It is not very detailed, not very robust. But the minute that you have a target in mind, when you have a clear policy in mind, your solutions start changing, your conversations start changing. So that's the role of policy that would come into there. When we are looking at the conversation on FPOs and farmer producer companies across the country, right? Now we are talking about 10,000 FPOs that the government wants to push. How do you build in sustainability? You talked about market linkage. How do you get sustainable agriculture practices into that itself? So that is something that you look at. How do you incentivize, right? If I have regenerative agriculture in my public procurement, am I going to say that anything that is more sustainable, organically proved, will have preference over traditional agriculture practices? If I have a whole network of Krishi Vigyan Kendras, those information centers, can I start integrating sustainability there so that the farmer has that knowledge upfront? Can I create technology, which, you know, a lot of people have smartphones now. Can we use app-based information systems, right? On pest management, on weather, on, market situation. Those are all things that help the farmer. So from policy, yes. From technology and innovation, it is driving. Technology and innovation will play a big role, but affordable technology is always going to be the big question, right? We, how do I get technology solutions that work for farmers on the ground? Yeah, if it is not affordable, or if it is available only to the larger farmers or to the bigger land holding sizes, then I guess that solution is incomplete. That solution is not complete in itself. So that's something that we will need. But I think if you have, can I actually prioritize startups and innovators who are working on this? Can my startup policies start recognizing that? Can I have accelerators, incubators that actually work with such food system, such solutions? Because I think in our startup innovation policies, we don't always have that lens. We don't always have that lens. Can I actually build sustainability into all these systems, right? And how do I create those platforms? Technology plays a big role in bridging the gap between what is available and to where it is needed. Not just from a food point of view, from an agri residue point of view, from other circularity research, to say that how is it that I can use agri residue into other supply streams, and how do I make that happen? What is the logistics? What is the value chain that will happen? And finance, of course, is the thing that makes the world go round, whether we like it or we don't like it. But the role of finance has also expanded a bit. It is not just provision of money. It's not just provision of, if you look at an organization like Samanuti, right, which works with farmers and farmer producer organizations, and the philosophy is to handhold the farmer, right, and understand the forward and backward linkages as well. So there is a need perhaps to relook at the role that some of the farmers would play, some of these institutions would play. And they have to collaborate, right? For example, if a research institute comes up with a technology, now socializing that technology or upscaling that technology is where perhaps the private sector comes in, right? Perhaps the civil society comes in to create that awareness. If I need to understand what the magnitude of the problem is and how do I look at capacity building, civil society plays a role over there, that why this issue is important. How do I link? I mean, when I'm looking at the questions in the chat, right? Different parts of the country have different challenges. How do you learn from each other? How do you bring these challenges into context, right? And if something good is happening in one part of the country, how do I make it known there? So that will not happen without collaboration, right? And 90% of your food, or 96% of your food, like I said, is also moving through the private sector. So today, if the government has to do something on food loss and waste, it is not happening without the private sector. It is just not happening without the private sector. And the reason why collaboration is important, because we need to relook at how we design our sustainable solutions. We still falter that our sustainable solution is not always working for the person on the ground.
Right.
Let's be very honest about that. And it is because they are not in these conversations. We are trying to think of a solution that will work for them sitting here. Be on the ground, understand the challenge there, understand the local context, understand what is it that they're already doing well, and how can you build on that rather than impose this one. So I think if we are looking at any meaningful sustainability solution or impact, you need to have collaboration. And if you look at examples again, a lot in food waste, that there are a number of coalitions, call to actions, whether you talk about in Australia or you talk in the UK, where different stakeholders, when they've come together and together worked out on targets that they want to do, is when actual change has started happening.
Perfect. Great points, Devyani. I think I know we are, I think, towards the last leg of the webinar. I think let's pick up, I think, couple of questions. I'd love to ask a couple of following questions, but I think I think within 1 hour, I think we can only ask a couple of questions. But the topic is itself so intriguing. I'd love to ask a couple of questions. But I think let's pick up the question which I think the audience has asked, and I'll start with, I think, the question which was actually like one of the people who have registered earlier. I think they have asked the question. The question is, like, why, despite huge investment in infrastructure and defense schemes, we have not been able to reduce loss in different stages of the value chain?
Couple of things, right? One, is the infrastructure accessible to all, right? The other thing was that your produce moves through such a long value chain. I think a key question which stakeholders have also highlighted is, where do you add this infrastructure? Right? Where do you add this infrastructure? Is it closer to production? Is it closer to consumption? What is it that you look at? So I think these are some of the issues. So we've definitely done better. It's not that this investment in infrastructure or this investment in other logistics has not helped. It has definitely improved. So one, accessibility to this infrastructure for all. Is it the best solution? Like a question that we also got asked was, and it's a fair enough question, we add cold storage.
I think there is a network issue there.
Yeah, I think it's Devyani and yeah. So I think while Devyani is coming back, I think what she was talking about largely is, I think, even though the infrastructures are there and even though there are, I think, defense schemes, most of the time the planning is not appropriate. Like, for example, we have a production center, how far the consumption center is there, whether the production center is actually done in a appropriate way so that you minimize the losses of transportation. I think the classic example Devan is talking about, right? I think most of the time when you grow tomato, you do not know whether there are different types of tomato varieties. So if your nearby consumption market is the table purpose variety, you need for your preparation of the kitchen material and curry, you need a different, that's called table purpose variety of tomato. But if your nearby market is more from the ketchup point of view, which is processing, then there's a different point of this tomato variety is required. And the science has developed, the seed companies has developed different types of those seeds variety, but most of the time farmers do not know. Unless and until someone has to closely work with them, guide them about the different types of, I think, the varieties to need to be required as per the consumption market. So this is what I think classic example is. So that's the reason I think having an infrastructure doesn't matter. I think solve the issue. Yes, it is important there. What sort of infrastructure you are talking about, whether you're talking about cold chain, end-to-end cold chain. It's not, and cold chain is not the answer also. Is before the cold chain starts, we need to talk about the reducing the losses during the harvesting stage itself, because a lot of, I think, before transportation, some of the vegetables need to be wrapped up in paper bags and other things which can minimize the transportation loss. So the whole idea is infrastructure is essential, but more than that, the planning of the production cycle as per the consumption market is more important. So this is the, I think, answer to the, I think, difference there. I know Devyani is traveling. I think she was operating from a hotel. I think we have lost the connections. Some of the question which is there, I think we'll definitely look back, and I think we'll connect with Devyani, I think, post this call, and I think we'll, some of the questions which was there, I think already Devyani has answered in terms of, I think, the how the tribal populations, I think, see the food losses and food waste. I think she has talked about that. I think we'll cover up, I think, those questions. Some of the other question, how can inclusion of school education be enabled in this concept? I think definitely, I think the student, I think, at the school level has to be sensitized in terms of the about this topic itself. In fact, during the agricultural, I think, subject, even the agricultural graduates are not being taught more about this food losses concept. I think our curriculum is very old, I think, and while these are the, I think, new generations problems, so we need to definitely upgrade our curriculum, starting from at the school level up to, I think, the graduates who are actually pursuing agricultural sciences, so that I think they the moment, I think, they pass out from their schools or, I think, different, I think, academic degree, they should start applying those concepts in the day-to-day life. So I think, since there is a, I think, internet connections, I think, and we have like towards the close next 2 minutes, I would like to thank all of you, I think, who have attended, I think, this evening. This topic is important to us, and I think the questions which I have received both from the registration and today we have received from the chat box, I think we'll take them, discuss with Devyani separately out of this, I think, and we'll get back to you. If possible, I think, if you can write to us in the email ID on the Sattva channel, or I think we can also ping us, I think, on share your email ID so that we can get back to you on the question which you have raised. But broadly, I think, if we see, I think we have talked about today about why circular economy and food losses are important. Mostly this is impacting our sustainable development goals, and country like India, which is facing the dual problem of, I think, food security as well as I think food losses is an important topic. Similarly, I think concept like, I think, regenerative agriculture, organic farming, conservative agriculture, or crop diversification are very key important in terms of, I think, reducing the food losses. You also need to have the local dynamics. You need to understand about the local production clusters and the consumption clusters, and accordingly try to bridge the gap. And finally, I think, in terms of enabling factor, there are policy can play an important role. Technology can definitely play an important role in terms of post-harvest technology and reducing the food losses. Innovative finance can bring like blended finance, and couple of innovative finances are required in terms of which requires some level of experimentation, which allow the innovators to experiment and develop some of the handheld tool which can minimize losses at the farm or at the during the transition of the value chain. So these are all key learnings from the sessions. And with that, I think we'll wrap up the sessions. Thank you everyone for taking out time today, and we'll get back to you any question which have not been addressed today. Sorry for this, I think, inconvenience which has resulted I think towards the last part of the sections, but we'll take all the questions seriously and get back to you on this. Thank you so much.